Hey, this is Anagalactic bringing you another presentation in cosmic geometry. Oh my goodness, what a term. Have you ever heard such a thing? Well, of course, there has to be a geometry to the universe. It's just that we can't quite see the edge, and there seems to be no center. Well, that makes geometry a bit of a challenge. Now, what we're going to cover today is just a little bit about time, because as we all know from Albert, time is now incorporated into a space-time formulation, which is considered to be the be-all and end-all of physics now, although it has been like that for close to a century, you could put it that way, that space-time has dominated physics. Now, I was beginning to go into a series on Paul Dirac for that very reason, that Paul Dirac, among the three or four top physicists who invented quantum mechanics, these would be Schrödinger, Heisenberg, and then there's a team of a couple of other men who made a foray, but it was Paul Dirac who got the actual wave equation that makes sense. Now, actually, the Schrödinger equation is more pragmatic and is more useful to the pseudoscientists who are probing the inner limit of pseudoparticles that fly out of high-speed collisions between protons. We're not concerned with their work because it's a fool's errand. The government does not think so, and that's why it continues. Because it's a source of power. Now, what Paul Dirac did that neither Schrödinger nor Heisenberg could do was to formulate a correct and provable, fully accepted equation of the waveform, which is exactly what the quantum is. It's a waveform. And since it's a waveform, it's not a particle, so it can't be measured and baffles the fuck out of all physicists from then until now. Nothing has changed. But what Paul Dirac did that made all the physicists remarkably happy is that he introduced a formula for the wave, that is the quantum, which is relativistic. In other words, it incorporates Einstein's relativity, which is extraordinarily difficult to define. And when you put relativity with the quantum, which is impossible to define, you have a nightmare. And that's where physics is at. The cutting edge of physics is psychotic. Nobody denies that. Nobody in their right mind denies that. And of course, most of the physicists are literally clinically out of their fucking minds. Don't worry about them. They're getting paid. They're getting paid to be out of their minds. They don't mind at all that they're completely lunatic and anti-scientific. That's okay. That's part of the phase of science. It's part of the cycle of science. You have to be nuts. Copernicus was nuts. Newton was actually considered to be a bit nuts, but the British treat people differently. Boshkovich was not considered to be nuts by anybody, but he was not considered to have done anything either, and we'll circle back to him. All of this is leading up to our definition of time. Absolutely the one last question remaining. It appears to be unanswerable. Nobody's been able to get it timed. Nobody knows what time is. I'd like to just show you a book here that I just picked up today, which I've been putting off reading because I don't trust Stephen Hawking with as far as he could hawk a loogie. He was absolutely out of his mind, but again, well paid, well respected. In this world, most men are satisfied with money, because then they survive. Well, Darwin came right out, although he did not actually invent the phrase survival of the fittest. It's fairly obvious that to survive at all, you have to conform. And money rules the world. Money rules the world. And money is controlled by governments. So all of this fits, and we've been over that in such extraordinary detail that we don't need to rehash it now. but I bring it to mind because without that overall perspective, which is the sign of an educated and logical man, is the larger your perspective, the wiser you're likely to be. I've made it my life's work to be at the top of that pyramid and have the widest perspective of all. But of course, everything's relative, and that's quite subjective and could be interpreted as megalomaniac. I do interpret it that way because I know what's going on in my own psychology. But again, all of this lunacy and psychosis, posturing, greed, lying, rampant lying, but mostly self-deception, mostly just a big game, all of that is natural. There's nothing unnatural about psychosis. You should not be afraid of the term psychosis. It's not the clinical definition of psychosis, it's the scientific definition, which is far more reasonable. Nobody gives a living fuck about real lunatics, just lock them up. Of course, that's not done, and most of those men go on to be politicians. They don't get locked up. They go on to be military men, fighters, just people who have nothing to do with reality. Although, they kind of do. And when a soldier comes to your door and kicks it down and then blasts you full of holes, then in the last milliseconds of your life, you'll realize that it really is real. That is the curse that hangs over all men, is that you're surrounded by lunatics. Now, the question that a real scientist asks is, am I a lunatic? Now, that's relative, and I think with other men in science, rational men who pride themselves on their logic, you still have to admit, first of all, you're human. Well, once you admit that, you're out of your goddamned mind. You're human. Humans aren't logical. Humans don't do anything right. 2,000 to 3,000 to 4,000 years of history have proved that humans are absolutely raging, psychotic creatures. No sense at all. Oops. Yeah, we do have some sense because we harnessed electricity, right? We invented various forms of transportation, heating and cooling. Oh my God. And then just one short century ago, we discovered the universe. Well, that's led to an outbreak of absolute real psychosis because a lot of these posturers, the top physicists, Feynman, and all the men that are out on the internet today, from Susskind to Green to Carroll to Kaku, these men are absolute lunatics. They know it. They're never going to admit it, but they know it. I carefully observe these men. They're raging lunatics. No connection with reality whatsoever in anything they talk about in any way. I find none of it. Today they make me kind of sick, and that's a natural reaction of a right-thinking man, as I'm trying to be. So in assaulting the notion of time, it's extremely important to disambiguate what lunatic pseudoscientists say about it and what a scientist actually needs to say about it in order to be a scientist. Now, in order to illustrate this a little more accurately, I should have to put it, first of all, there's me in a prior lecture dealing with issues related to this. I just want to show you I have all this capability. But here is my new thesis paper, which will form the eventual structure of a LaTeX document to submit to Archive and other sources that I have identified. Pardon me, it is very hot and dry here. Give me a moment. In case you also need refreshment, I strongly recommend this substance. Time is extremely difficult to define. I can go farther than that. I've made it my work for the past 3 years to actually define time, that is extraordinarily difficult to do. It is the hardest problem left to physics. All of the problems in physics now, from the quantum paradox to the cosmology, which is raging lunacy, it's all based, you can find a common factor in all of the currently cutting edges of science. They're all related to time. The quantum paradox is due directly to our inability to understand time. Now, Albert Einstein is a key figure in the history of the definition of time because he was the first man ever to define time in any way. And he did so in a way that shocked the living fuck out of every goddamn scientist who encountered it. Even Albert was a little overwhelmed. It took him 10 years from the time of special relativity to develop his generalized, really volume space definition of general relativity, which is an equation of time. And nobody had ever done this before. Newton knew nothing of time. He pushed it away. He didn't want to deal with it at all. And in fact, he did the same thing with space. Well, that was quite a while ago. We're talking about coming up on 400 years ago. So that's passé. Maxwell did not deal with time in his electrodynamic theory. Planck did not deal directly with time in his discovery of the energic quantum. And nobody really was forced to deal with time. Minkowski, Hermann Minkowski, who had a dubious relationship with Einstein, he was one of Einstein's teachers, and he's the man who invented spacetime. Albert did not. Hermann did. What Albert did was he turned it into a bona fide, structured theory that is a framework of space. And Einstein's great accomplishment was a definition of space. The very first definition of space of all time. And the way he defined space was in coordination with time. So what did he say? It's so simple that it's deceptive. And it's hard at first to understand why scientists today are so baffled out of their minds that they come up with such things as time dilation, even time travel, which is clinically psychotic. They have ideas about the origin of the universe, which is pure fantasy, no relationship to reality whatsoever, and bizarre notions of the universe, such that it has characteristics which it can't be substantiated in any way. It must be stated out loud finally. I mean, at this late date, somebody has to come out and say it. Now, we've had critics of cosmological physics and quantum theoretical physics, which are absolutely damnatory. We have such heroes and heroines as Dr. Sabine Hossenfelder, who just ridicules the mathematicians right to their faces. And she's in the industry and she gets away with this. But we also have some bona fide scientists. Hossenfelder is not really, she's not qualified to talk about science. She's just not. She has degrees, she does research, actually experiments in quantum experimentation. She experiments at the quantum level for money. But the reason she's unqualified is she can't hold her own with a real physicist. She's not a real physicist. But she's an excellent communicator. And this is greatly valuable in science today. I admire Dr. Sabine Hossenfelder, but she's one of those dolts, just a person who thinks that she's qualified to make statements because of her high-profile position. And she comes out and says she gave a whole lecture within the past year, or certainly no further in the past than 2 years. She had a whole lecture on why gravity is not a force. Well, that's bullshit. Of course, gravity is a force. And the only reason she says that gravity is not a force is it's an attention grabber. And I'm sorry, Sabina. I love you forever no matter what you do. You cannot sin in my eyes, Sabina. But you're not a scientist. You're an anti-scientist. You're not helping. But here's why I'm pointing at her. Is because she's the best we have. There is nobody else who is capable of criticizing science. Now, I don't mean her alone. I mean in her class. An unqualified pseudoscientist who at least has the courage to speak the truth as she sees it. But to go up a few levels, to get up to the level of a real scientist, we're talking about men such as Alexander Unziker, who I've seen videos, and you can see them too. If you look for the name Alexander Unziker out on YouTube, I guarantee you're going to be impressed out of your frickin' gourd that such a man even exists, because he's as rare. He's a rarity. You have these guys like Michio Kaku, who's insane. All he does is lie. That's all he does. Leonard Susskind of Stanford University, one of the most prestigious universities in history. And Leonard Susskind is talking about physics as if he were in a straitjacket and frothing at the mouth. He's a nutcase. Okay, what I'd like to talk about today, just a little bit, is A Brief History of Time by one of the most famous theoretical physicists of our day, Stephen Hawking. Everybody's heard of Stephen Hawking. He wrote a book, A Brief History of Time. I just showed it to you. Here it is. I've just started reading it, but I can tell you just from having perused the book and read the first few sections, it's unbelievable that he has this title, A Brief History of Time. He never talks about time in that whole book. Never mentions time once in scientific context. He's a dreamer. He's a fantasizer. Well, that's why his book is more popular than Euclid's Elements and the Bible and Shakespeare combined. This little man, whom I admired, don't get me wrong about my opinion of Dr. Stephen Hawking. If I meet him in the afterlife, I will be just staring at him, waiting for him to say something. I think he's amazing. But as far as being a scientist, no. No, he's not a scientist. He's a fantasizer. Science fiction is real now. And these guys like Brian Greene and Sean Carroll, they know you. They know you inside and out. They're trained in the industry. They're like actors. And their whole... Of course, they do a shitload of work, and I pity them. Again, if I were to meet Brian Greene and or Sean Carroll, either in this life or the afterlife, I'm not saying a word to these men until they talk to me. Because they're my superiors. Oh, yes. Except in one tiny little regard. This has to do with science. It has to do with rational logic. It has to do with mathematics and geometry. And I'm afraid these guys are just not in my class. Now, Unziker is, okay? Unziker and I could have a conversation, but I could never have a conversation with Michio Kaku, Brian Greene, Sean Carroll. I could never have a conversation with Lex Friedman, because I would dominate them. If once we had our introductions and everybody's settled and it's time to listen to me, that's what they're going to do. They're going to listen to me. I'm sorry, Mr. Miller, speaking of myself, these men are not there to listen to anybody. They're big heads. They're brainiacs. They're why people hate mathematicians. It's because of Brian Greene, Leonard Susskind, Michio Kaku, and Sean Carroll. Now, there's another class that are just basically communicators, like Lex Friedman. I admire the hell out of all these guys for what they do well, which I am not in their class. But in science, really, we got to be brutally honest here. We want to do science. Well, they don't. They simply lie. And that's all they do. And so when they talk about time, as Hawking does, they simply don't talk about it. So when you talk about supermassive black holes, they're not talking about the phenomenon that was discovered in the heavens. They're talking about a mathematical framework to which they've devoted their lives in order to make money. Well, that changes the game for any human. That's why I'm quite gratified, proud in a way, to say that I have nothing to do with the industry or money. Well, of course, that's the perfect opportunity for their gentlemen's club to just say, sayonara, little man, you didn't work your way through the industry. You didn't get a PhD. You didn't pay $100,000. You didn't risk your life to make a living at this. We did. And so we get to talk. That's fair. That is perfectly fair. But science is unfair. I am still a scientist, and if I say I know what time is and they don't, and I can prove it, then I'm the man. Well, that's why you're tuned in, hopefully. A brief history of time is bullshit. You're not going to learn anything. So, what do I say about time that changes the game? In an approach to defining time, we have a choice between common perception, just time passing. Everyone knows what time is. There's no mystery about time in that sense. We all agree on it. We agree on time more closely than we agree on color. Okay? So we have that choice just to define time according to what we all know. Well, that's not good enough for science, so what's the next choice? Philosophic extrapolation. What does time mean? What does it mean for humans? Well, then you're talking about life and death. So we don't want that. That's unscientific. That's humanistic. So do we have any other choices left? It's always at the end of the list. Yes, you have one last choice. You can use your brain. You can use your onboard logic system to get a definition of time. Well, here's the strange fact. Nobody's been able to do that. Einstein certainly did not. And he said that he did not. He didn't say that he had figured out a definition of time. All he did was find a mathematical and pseudo-geometric relationship between space and time. Well, that changes everything. I've devoted an enormous amount of energy to understanding that, as every rational scientist would. Why? Because it's been proved by space travel, human space travel, that special and general relativity are correct. He got the right answer. And the difference between special and general relativity, not even Dr. Leonard Susskind can define, but I can, so that a high schooler can understand it. That's unique. So I've learned over the past 3 years, I have a unique power. I am able to explain physics, but in order to do so, you might ask, what are my credentials? Well, my credentials are higher than any PhD or Nobel Prize laureate. I know the geometry and I can prove it rigorously. I can prove what the quantum is. And I can prove the relationship between space and time, and I guarantee you nobody else has it. That's the advantage of being a discoverer who goes through the work to prove what he finds. I've done that, And now the next step to make me famous, this will earn me a Nobel Prize. No questions asked. I am the next Nobel Prize winner. Ooh! Except, oh my God! The world is so unfair. Oh! I'm not going to get a Nobel Prize even though I deserve it. You know why not? Science is closed to the outsider. I don't have a PhD, and that's the end of the lecture. You're never going to learn anything, because in order to learn anything, you'll have to learn it from me. Well, the bigwig, psychotic fantasy engineers are all in agreement. Do not listen to Scott Allen Miller. He's not one of us. Now, all of this is in the future. None of this has happened. I'm projecting so that I'll be able to face what happens to me when the time comes. Even Yeshua had to do that. And I am not above my master. To the proportion that I go into the ring, which I'm going in this election season, I'm going in with my theory to broadcast it to anybody. It's just like one of those people in the football stadium, actually a group of people, who hold up a big banner of John 3:16. Well, how many people do you think watching on TV or in the stadium who see that God loves you so much he gave his only, whatever, is going to change any minds? Zero. These people are only doing what they're doing to vent because they're frustrated. They know that no one sees what they see. Well, quite frankly, I won't go into that, but those people who hold up those banners, they're not Christians, they're idiots. To a man and woman, especially the ones that speak in tongues. How do I know that? Never mind. We're in science now, but that's all these guys do. Hey, kids! Time dilates. Because the universe is expanding, time dilates. Pieces of wood contract. One twin gets older than the other because of going the speed of light. Insanity! In the next presentation, we're going to reintroduce you to logic, rationality, science, and here's the part that no one else can do: solutions, answers, finalizations. Push all the bullshit aside and give the correct answer. Has anybody been able to do that? Darling, nobody will ever be able to do that until they learn to listen to me, because I have the geometry. And I hope you keep looking up at night. It's a little past the new moon. Looking up at night is what you want to do. That's always the way I close these lectures. Under a half an hour. Absolute miracle. I didn't go on for 5 hours. It's very difficult for me to rein in, because being a real scientist and having logic and doing the work and grinding out the proofs, I got the answer. Does it make a man happy? I can say it's making me happy, but it's incomplete until it's shared. So that's what I'm doing. Doesn't make any difference what any of these big asses say. It doesn't make any difference what they say, think, do, or feel. They're not scientists. They're fakes! I'm the real thing. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.